You wake up one day and have a yearning for something undefinable and nebulous. An experience, a memory plays in your mind. One of your favorite games as a child. You frantically look for it and find it. The box is dusty, so you wipe it clean. You see the game manual, open it up and take a quick look as you wait for the console to boot up. They just don't make them like this anymore. Finally, the console starts and you start playing. Is it exactly like you remember? Or is it barely a shadow of what you thought it had been? Was it always this slow to start? It really doesn't look that good anymore. The controls are quite finicky. Slowly, your nostalgia drains into a bottomless pit. You loved this game. You remember it as one of your favorite memories. But sadly, it hasn't aged well. But why? Video games, and the industry associated with them, started about 50 years ago. That's a short enough time that some people who saw the literal invention of video games are still around, enjoying the best of what video games have to offer today. It's an incredibly short period, and the absolutely amazing development of video games in that time period is astonishing. Comparing Pong to a modern game like Starfield shows how far games have come. Video games are iterative, building on what has come before. Many great games have direct sequels. Others have spiritual successors, games that attempt to iterate on the most beloved aspects of a previous game, even if they can't directly follow the story and intellectual property of that game. Iteration has allowed for an amazing progression of video games over time. But what about games that were so good that they don't need innovation? What makes games age? What makes some games so good that they still feel amazing to play 20 or more years after they were made, when thousands of games have been created, perhaps even attempting to iterate on those classics that still feel perfect?
Aged and dated gameplay stems primarily from games that have had sequels which smooth and streamline their gameplay. This can happen in many different ways, such as the progression from aiming with the keyboard in Doom and other classic shooters to eventually using a mouse, and even with the use of an analog stick on a controller. After experiencing the more natural tools such as a mouse or analog stick, the relatively foreign concept of using a keyboard to aim can be quite off-putting, which makes a game that tries to use such controls feel extremely dated. For example, the original Doom didn't have vertical aiming. If you aimed in a direction, if an enemy was in front of you and you fired, it hit. This is true even when an enemy is much higher on the screen and your weapon doesn't seem to be pointing at it. Aspects of gameplay that give a dated feeling can also be less hands-on. For example, Symphony of War is a Fire Emblem-like tactical RPG that released in the last few years. It's admittedly pretty good. However, it has quite a few quality of life issues that make it feel dated in quite a few different ways, especially in comparison to the modern Fire Emblem games. First of all, Symphony of War doesn't have an auto-end turn function. You have to keep track of all the units that have moved, and if you attempt to end the turn without moving everyone, there's no way to tell which units have moved or not. This is a problem that was solved at least as early as the Fire Emblem GBA games, where moved units would become grayed out. Additionally, when all units moved, the turn would auto-end. This forces odd pauses and awkward moments where the game feels off simply because it's missing minor features. For reference, the first Fire Emblem game released in America came out in 2003, while Symphony of War came out in 2022. Another feature of modern Fire Emblems that can make older Fire Emblems feel a bit dated is the mechanic that lets you go back a few turns to redo them, allowing the player to fix a positioning mistake. This is nice to have, especially for Fire Emblem fans who love to play on classic mode, because often players would completely reset their consoles in order to prevent a character from dying. Having the ability to manage this built into the game itself is much nicer than having to totally reset a map as one would have to do in the older versions such as the GBA games. It's a surprising concession because it acknowledges a common facet of playing the series as a whole, and even recognizes that attempting to dissuade the player is unlikely to help much, and so they simply embrace it as a feature, which arguably even provides a boost to the popularity of the games as a whole because it makes the game easier to pick up and play. Going back to older games can feel a bit frustrating because you either have to embrace your mistakes and accept your failures, something I'm sure we can all admit to struggling with at least a little bit, or you have to completely reset the entire console and map in order to prevent the death of a character. While the older Fire Emblem games still feel good to play in general, this part of them does feel a bit dated in comparison.
Interestingly, there are some mechanics that have aged poorly in most games, but not all. Tank controls are a method of controlling your character, where you have to turn your character and can only move forward to where they're facing. This means that moving forward and sideways at the same time is usually impossible. This is a pretty restrictive style movement, and for most games like GoldenEye or early exploration games, this control scheme has generally aged pretty poorly. The restrictive issues presented in tank controls actually form a benefit in games that have specifically taken them into account as part of the gameplay though. Games like Resident Evil 4 have aged relatively well, despite using tank controls and other movement restrictions, such as inability to move while shooting. This works so well because the controls play into the feeling of the game itself, where you are expected to commit entirely to either running away or standing your ground and fighting. Not every improvement to a game is universally beloved too. In StarCraft 1, players are required to micromanage their units, pathing through the map. In StarCraft 2, the pathfinding algorithm is much improved, so players don't need to pay as much attention to managing small things as mundane as movement. This difference is so important to many players that when StarCraft Remastered was developed, one of their primary points of focus was to ensure that the pathfinding algorithm's little issues were recreated as faithfully as possible, despite being clearly inferior to the iteration. One of the reasons StarCraft 1 is so loved though is that it provides nearly unlimited possibilities for skill expression, and parts of that is dealing with the somewhat awkward controls. Players who can manage many small, seemingly unimportant aspects of the game better than others are simply better, with more time to focus on overwhelming their opponent. This means that not all players love that some of these small problems were removed, even if they are issues and they prevented some people from enjoying the game as much as they could.
Many games iterate on themselves by creating quality of life changes. These changes are usually minor, without placing many huge effects on the gameplay itself. Rather, they usually streamline the work needed to accomplish things that are quite common, such as highlighting where you need to go for a quest or a mission. In another case, instead of needing to open a menu, navigate to a crafting screen, and then selecting what you want to craft, games like Horizon shift the work of crafting new ammo directly into the ammo selection menu. Running low on arrows? Select the arrows you want, then simply craft more. Some games, such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Diablo, even take note of the copious amounts of loot and useless loot that they give you, and provide a simple one-click button to sell all of that useless stuff to a vendor, freeing up your inventory much quicker and letting you enjoy the game more. Some games have little features that make the game significantly more palatable, when they would otherwise be quite frustrating. Precision platformers like Super Meat Boy or Celeste are both quite hard, and anyone who plays them can expect to fail hundreds if not even thousands of times. Now imagine if they took much longer than the short few seconds that it takes to respawn and try the level again. These games would be significantly worse, only for the fact that players would end up stewing in rage when they miss even minor jumps, instead of immediately having the opportunity to try the challenge again. The ability to skip cutscenes also functions as a huge quality of life change that almost every game should have. Everyone who's ever tried to replay a game has felt the pain of being forced to rewatch a cutscene that you have no interest in wasting your time on once again. Massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft have many little quality of life features that, whether you love them or hate them, can significantly smooth the experience. These can range from quest marks on the map to looking for group and looking for raid finders built into the game. Even small things such as removing the need to travel back to a city and manually buy new skills after a level up have been removed over time, making the process of leveling up much smoother. Other systems such as adding a mount stable allows players to have access to all of their mounts easily. Previously, player mounts were housed in their inventory and took up precious space in player bags, and would need to be manually assigned to a hotkey for quick access. This has made them much more annoying to quickly use more than one or two different mounts, and as the game grew, so did the number of available mounts. Over the nearly 20 years that World of Warcraft has been around, there have been hundreds or possibly more such quality of life additions. The Fire Emblem series, similar to the additions noted beforehand, have one more change that, while minor, is quite nice. Instead of needing to move a unit, then manually determine if you want to attack a nearby unit, players can group the command to attack an enemy in the same command as the movement itself. This makes gameplay smoother and saves time over the entirety of a playthrough. While obviously not revolutionary, small beneficial changes like these can make going back to previous games in a series just that little bit more cumbersome. A game that feels like it has aged poorly is not always caused by one or two major flaws, but rather a lot of small things that degrade the experience. Some of these small things may not even be part of the game's design itself, but rather the hardware or optimization quality. Some games benefit quite a lot from the growth of technology providing a better general performance, meaning higher frame rates and better frame times, meaning that the gameplay itself just flows smoother. Other games games have more optimized controls. The original Street Fighter and other fighting games in the early era of games have a bit of infamy for hard-to-hit special commands. Despite being the same as modern special commands, the degree of precision needed for the earliest iterations of the games is quite different from modern iterations, where the amount of skill needed to consistently hit something is lessened in lieu of ensuring the game is fun to play, no matter the skill level. The newest iteration of Street Fighter actually includes the modern control scheme, which aims to make it significantly easier to pick up and play fighting games without needing to grind out the mechanical ability to execute the different aspects of the game. Fighting games were not the only genre that had issues with unresponsive and sometimes questionable controls. While not always directly associated with controlling a character, older games often had a bit of delay between actions. This could range from locking players into animations to needing a moment to process an action before allowing the user to input another. Regardless, the phenomenon of forcing players to wait between actions can tremendously slow down the pace of a game, making it feel much more aged than modern games where many systems are explicitly built to be cancelable, or have even been designed with uncancelable animations in mind. This delay is most often pronounced in the navigation of UI menus, which can have significant lag between selecting an option and actually moving to the next menu, often caused simply through long and pointless animations moving from one screen to another.
Animation and control fluidity improvements are seen in even relatively modern games, where combat fluidity and gadget usage improves quite a bit from ARKHAM ASYLUM to the sequels. Even the Dark Souls games and their successors have slowly lessened some of the restrictions they impose upon players. Rather than in the original Dark Souls, where players could only dodge in cardinal directions, the sequels allow players to dodge in basically any direction. Additionally, Elden Ring has opened up the player to a dedicated jump button, rather than the unequivocally awkward system of needing a running start before tapping another button to jump. The original Dark Souls also forced the player to commit to healing a lot more than the sequels did, preventing the player from moving at all when drinking the Estus Flask to recover health. In the sequels, players are allowed to move, even if at a reduced pace, which allows them to stay a bit safer, and even frees up the developer to increase the pace of some of the bosses. Altogether, the changes from Dark Souls until Elden Ring make the original feel surprisingly aged in comparison, despite the fact that Dark Souls itself still feels fantastic to play. The ARKHAM series has seen a number of game-altering changes that when traveling backwards are sorely missed. The grapnel boost added in Arkham City and a default tool in Arkham Knight with multiple additional levels to unlock for higher speeds allows the player to move across the larger environment quicker than previously possible. This improvement is huge. It makes traversal without it feel clunky in comparison. Another feature that was introduced in Arkham Knight was the addition of the fear takedowns, which allow for clearing out larger groups of enemies quickly. As you take down enemies silently, you can build up a fear meter, which allows you to take down multiple enemies that are near each other in succession. While Arkham Knight added more enemies than the previous entries to compensate for this new ability, the lack of it is still notable when returning to the older games. The advancement of hardware has also allowed an increased usage of relatively minor systems that are now so commonplace that are simply expected in some form or another. For example, a save system. While save systems are implemented in many different ways, autosaves, manual saves, and even saves managed by the system that prevents players from save scumming or reloading to prevent something they don't want happening from happening, a game that didn't have some form of a save system released now would be mind-boggling. This compares to games from the early days, which required some sort of passcode in order to save. While not an explicit part of the game itself in most cases, the modern usage of SSDs in comparison to standard hard drives to store data makes the game run a lot faster, with much less time wasted sitting on loading screens. Going back to an old console which uses standard hard drives feels agonizing when you play a game that can spend upward of 30 seconds to even sometimes a few minutes just waiting for the level to load. It's even worse when the game is constantly forcing you into loading screens for one reason or another. One of the first big improvements to loading screens that can be seen is the crack in the wall transition that started to appear in games like the Tomb Raider series and even the God of War game from 2018. This is definitely an improvement over the standard loading screens, as it doesn't take you out of the experience, but it's really just a way of cleverly hiding the problem, as the game is still limited by its hardware. And when compared to modern games on the PS5 that take full advantage of the SSD speeds, like the new Spider-Man game that allows for nearly instantaneous fast fast travel, it makes the crack in the wall trick seem slow in comparison. The effects of the SSD loading speeds can even be seen in the actual gameplay itself, allowing you to move throughout the open worlds quicker, making the game feel more immersive and exhilarating. For example, look no further than the new Spider-Man 2 game. Swinging through the city not only feels great due to its physics-based system, but also with the addition of the web wings, the wind tunnels, the slingshot launch, and the overall faster web swinging, you can travel through the map at insane speeds, which not only feels more exhilarating, but also has the benefits of reducing travel time to the objective, allowing you to spend more time taking on those baddies. Perhaps the ultimate form of mechanical advancement changing to make older and newer games feel different is the iteration of text adventures like Zork into clicking adventure games which operate with similar systems such as King's Quest or similar puzzle games like the Deponia series. While the early King's Quest games required you to type commands into a console alongside their visual accompaniment, similar to old text adventure games, point-and-click adventures generally focus on letting the player exclusively interact with the interface. This commonly manifest as dragging and dropping items, or adjusting puzzles exclusively through the use of the mouse.
About the actual gameplay though. In some cases, modern design ideas and older game ideas can clash, leading to someone who plays contemporary games to feel that older games are aged simply because of the design tendencies that older games often have. RPGs, or JRPGs, are a genre that often seem to imply some amount of grinding, or simply playing the game in a mundane and repetitive way in order to increase your character's power, which will often allow you to advance. While not entirely removed from modern iterations of the genre, it's much less common for a game to have grinding play such an integral role in its progression. Some modern games explicitly design the leveling curve around this by enforcing diminishing returns on your character level after a level or two of over-leveling, such as in the Trails of Cold Steel series. Other examples are the live system that many platformers used to have, or MMO-style fetch quests, which forced you to kill the same enemy over and over, hoping to get them to drop a specific item until you had enough. These sorts of quests had little value aside from giving something to do, and were functionally just grinding with some makeup tacked on. Other games have different design changes that may become even more common in the future. Some of the recent Tales games have done away with a mana system to gate off powerful abilities in lieu of simplifying to cooldown gates instead. This minimizes the amount of information a player has to internalize and take into account, and rather allows the player to develop a feel for when skills are available. Other games have experimented with removing the need to manage health and items after a battle by letting units immediately regenerate and heal after a fight. This lets the most important parts of a game, the combat, take more focus and have more opportunities for more interesting decision making, instead of forcing the player to deal with these things in between combat encounters. Persona 5 presents its UI in a way that is clear and streamlined. And combat is mapped to each of the 4 face buttons, allowing the player to easily navigate the menus and determine what they want to do quickly. This makes combat quick and engaging, and even when you spend tens of hours over the course of a playthrough doing functionally the exact same thing, it never gets old. The LEGO games focus on allowing the gameplay to guide the user experience. LEGO Indiana Jones 2, The Adventure Continues, added a dynamic co-op screen which allowed 2 players to only play on a split screen if they were too far away from each other, and without restricting each player to a short distance away from each other. This made the game feel much more open and interesting for both players. Another LEGO game also added the ability to quickly switch between characters in order to allow for different types of problem solving without needing to trek back to a hub or similar in order to change characters. Nothing else, this let the player choose who they wanted to play as whenever they wanted to play that character. If you want to see just how far the LEGO game's combat has come, play the newest game, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, then go back and play the first LEGO Star Wars games. When playing them back to back, you can really see how stiff and rigid the old combat feels, and can quickly notice that there's really no variety to it compared to the new combat style, which adds a variety of combat moves, combos, ranged attacks, and just feels smoother in general. Old RTS games showcase, at least marginally, just how far games have come. Dune 2, released in 1992, became the baseline for modern RTS gameplay design, and still seems unimaginably old in comparison to modern variations on the genre. For example, to command a unit to do something, first the player would need to select a unit, select a command, and then click on the map to issue the order. This would have to be repeated for each unit. Tedious, slow, and cumbersome, this user experience is a far cry from modern variations like STARCRAFT 2, where the player is allowed to select numerous units, command them all using simple mouse clicks or keybinds, and, with control groups, to allow quick switching between multiple groups of units. One system that arguably demarcates a difference in era between older and newer games is that of contextual controls. Modern games will often allow using only one button to do various things, depending on where the player is focused. A single button can be to interact with an item, talk with a character, open a door, pick something up, or many other options. In comparison, many older games would have each of these commands bound to an entirely separate button. This would make learning to play a new game something that players would legitimately need to study. It wouldn't be enough to play through whatever, if any, tutorial that was present in the game itself. Games like Assassin's Creed take this to the next level, even overloading so many different commands into one or two different buttons that often the player won't even know exactly what they're telling the game to do, rather simply going along with it. This is because nearly every part of the free-running or parkour of Assassin's Creed is built into the run button, the right trigger, and the game manages what command is output depending on where the player points the character. This has changed marginally over the course of the series, but in general the player controls not the parkour itself, but the direction they want to attempt to parkour in. Despite the many reasons already outlined, not everyone will agree on what ages a game. Some people enjoy the unrefined controls of older games, or prefer the finer level of control that explicit keybinds for every action can provide. Others might malign different quality of life changes as diluting the experience and letting the game play for you. But just as in real life, we can most often see age, not simply feel it. You might be able to tell someone is old by how they speak, by the words they use, the cadence they speak in. If you were to listen to someone, you might be able to get a decent read on how old they are. If you look at them though, you know, age shows. Some people can age slower than others, but once someone passes the threshold of age, it's nearly impossible to come back. Age shows. The same is true for games. An aged game will always look aged, and games that age well, or poorly, become evident fairly quickly. Many early 3D games have clearly aged poorly, with ugly triangles and bland designs. Final Fantasy VII, one of the most beloved games of all time, has clearly, visually, aged quite poorly. Other games like the original Tomb Raiders, Star Fox, Pokemon Red and Blue, and many more have all aged relatively poorly in terms of graphical quality. In contrast, some games have aged so incredibly well that they're functionally immortal. Mirror's Edge released in 2008, and yet manages to look comparable, or arguably even better, than some games released in just the last year or two. While parts of the game, such as character models, can look notably worse than modern equivalents, the general style of the game blows almost any other game out of the water, even today. This is mostly attributable to a clean and simple style with a great deal of respect paid to color schemes and lighting. Almost every part of the game tries to provide simple and clean models of whatever, and each part of the game is presented with care. The end result's a game that is beautiful even today, with memorable cityscapes and imagery.
Many other games have managed to age beautifully, though 3D games that age well are much rarer. Some 3D games that have aged quite well are the Borderlands series, the Dishonored series, and the Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. Each of these has an interesting artistic style that lends itself to looking good even years later. Many different games from the pixel art era are beloved and considered to have aged wonderfully in terms of graphics. This list includes games such as Final Fantasy Tactics, Chrono Trigger, Super Mario World, Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, Tactics Ogre, and so many more. There are even more examples of modern games that have adopted the stylistic elements of pixel art and will no doubt age just as beautifully as their older counterparts. This includes games such as Celeste, Hyper Light Drifter, Dave the Diver, Exonium Verge, The Messenger, Vampire Survivors, Katana Zero, Moonlighter, Blasphemous. There's so many. We actually did a whole video on pixel art's timelessness. Games that age beautifully don't just exist in the pixel art space though. There are many other art styles that work well and manage to look good even as they age. Okami uses an art style inspired by traditional Japanese Sumiya ink art, which lends it a surreal and fantastical tone. Cuphead boasts a hand-drawn art style directly inspired by old-school animation. Hollow Knight simplifies and cleanly represents many different bugs in different parts of the kingdom of Hollow Nest. Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisp have a beautiful hand-painted art style that makes the world seem deep and engaging. Games like the Astral Tier take low poly and transform it into an immediately recognizable style that feels great to interact with when using the terrain transformation systems. Some games have had an impressive change in art style over the years, with the original Street Fighter and then its sequels Street Fighter 2 and 3 showing how much further the same style can go. Something like Borderlands can show how good an art style can look even years later. Comparing the first game to the third shows that the general ideas of the style are the same, and the major differences are just that of detail and not much more. The latest game certainly looks better, but only marginally, despite a 10-year gap between the release of the first and the third. Games age in different ways. Some age visibly, while some age mechanically, lessening the experience of interacting with them. However they age, some age much slower than others, either because they look timeless, or nothing better has come along and redefined how we interact with the systems in the game. Frankly, it's amazing there's so many games that still hold up today, even after 20 or 30 years of iteration and development to build upon. What are your favorite games, and have they aged as well as you thought?
Thanks for watching. We worked really hard on this one. We've really been trying to up the quality of audio and the footage. Hopefully that's been working out a lot. We'd love to hear any thoughts you guys have on what makes gameplay age. Remember to join our Discord and comment, like, subscribe, all this stuff that nobody ever wants to hear, but we have to say because that's just part of this job. Let us know what you thought of the video as a whole. We always love to hear critiques and criticism because we want to just make this better and more interesting for not only you guys, but for ourselves as well. A shout out to our patrons, J, Rev, and CC. You guys let us do all of this, and it's super awesome. Thank you so much. And we plan on releasing one more video essay this year. We're hoping to, make it even better. So hopefully you guys come back for the next one. Thank you. Peace.